He's still on the phone, so you can hear him go in. And then as he's getting closer to the house, you can start hearing screaming, which is Karina. And then as he goes in the front door, it gets louder.
Some emergencies arrive with sirens. Others begin with a phone call so chaotic that the truth takes hours to surface. Just before sunrise, a 911 dispatcher received a call from a man who sounded shaken. He said his sister-in-law had just contacted him, terrified, claiming someone was inside her house. Almost simultaneously, another call came in, this time directly from the home itself. A child was crying on the line before an adult voice took over. There was blood, there was screaming, and there was a man who would never wake up. What authorities walked into that morning was not just a crime scene, it was the collapse of an entire family's reality. A respected local farmer lay dead in his own living room, shot while sitting where he slept every night. No forced entry, no weapon in sight, no clear suspect. At first glance, it looked like a nightmare carried out by a stranger. But the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove far more disturbing, because it wasn't hiding outside the house, it was already inside. When deputies arrived, the sun had barely risen. The home stood quietly against the rural backdrop, giving no hint of the violence that had occurred inside. This was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Fields, long roads, familiar faces. Murder was not part of this town's vocabulary. Inside the living room, the victim was found slumped in a recliner. Blood soaked his shirt. 2 gunshot wounds to the face would later be confirmed. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken doors or windows. His wife was still in the house, hysterical, covered in blood, clinging to his body. Officers noted her intense emotional reaction, though in moments like these, shock can manifest in unpredictable ways. Children were present in the home.
Here that she was rubbing her face against his face, specifically in the area where the gunshot wounds were later located, so essentially covering her face with Ryan Cooper's blood.
That detail alone made the scene difficult to process. According to her initial account, she had been asleep when she heard a loud noise, something like a crash. She assumed something had fallen. She said she briefly looked around, saw nothing unusual, and went to the kitchen window to check outside. There was no one there, no movement, no sound. Later, she claimed she turned on the living room light and realized something was terribly wrong. Her husband wouldn't wake up. Blood was everywhere. She insisted someone must have broken in, but investigators were already struggling with that theory. Nothing in the house suggested an intruder, no forced entry, no stolen items. Even more troubling, everyone else in the house was unharmed. The children were asleep upstairs. The family dog, a large and aggressive animal, had not reacted at all. In cases like this, details matter. If a stranger had entered the home, how did they move silently? How did they avoid waking the children? Why leave no weapon behind, but also no trail out? As the scene was processed, one detail stood out immediately. Only one shell casing was found, despite 2 gunshot wounds. That meant something was missing. Someone had taken it. The case that began as a possible home invasion was already unraveling, and as detectives started asking harder questions, the focus slowly shifted, not outward, but inward, toward relationships, toward secrets, toward things the town believed could never exist behind such a normal front. And this was only the beginning. From the moment investigators stepped back and reviewed the scene as a whole, one uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. The story being told did not match the evidence being found. At first, the working theory was simple: a break-in, a random act of violence. That assumption guided the earliest questions. Officers asked about strangers, suspicious vehicles, unfamiliar noises. They looked for signs of forced entry, missing valuables, disturbed rooms. They found none. The house was intact. Doors were locked. Windows were unbroken. Nothing appeared stolen. Everything was exactly where it should have been, except for one man, dead in his recliner. That immediately narrowed the field. Crimes committed by strangers tend to leave chaos behind. This one did not. The living room was calm, almost orderly. There were no overturned chairs, no defensive wounds suggesting a struggle, no trail of panic moving through the house. What stood out instead was what was missing. The murder weapon was gone. A single .22 caliber shell casing had been recovered from the floor, yet the autopsy would later confirm that the victim had been shot twice in the face. One casing was unaccounted for. That meant someone had not only fired the weapon, but had taken the time to retrieve evidence afterward. That is not the behavior of a panicked intruder. It is the behavior of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Investigators also began questioning the timeline more closely. According to the wife's statement, she heard a loud noise during the night. She did not immediately investigate. She looked briefly into the living room, thought her husband was asleep, then went to the kitchen window to check outside. But this explanation raised several issues. Gunshots are not subtle. Even a small caliber firearm produces a sharp, unmistakable sound, especially inside a house at night. The idea that a gunshot could be mistaken for something falling felt increasingly implausible. Then there was the issue of the dog. The family owned a large, highly protective dog known to be aggressive towards strangers. According to the account given, the dog was inside the house that night, yet it had not barked, attacked, or reacted in any noticeable way. For investigators, this was a major red flag. Dogs respond instinctively to unfamiliar sounds and people, particularly in the middle of the night. The likelihood that an unknown intruder could enter, shoot someone twice, move through the house, and leave without triggering the dog was extremely low. And then there were the children. One child normally slept in the living room near his father. In the days before the murder, that sleeping arrangement had been changed, and the child had been moved upstairs. The younger children were sleeping with their mother. Again, not evidence on its own, but a detail that refused to sit quietly. As detectives continued questioning, they noticed subtle shifts in the wife's behavior. Her emotional responses were intense but inconsistent. Some questions triggered panic. Others were brushed off quickly. She returned again and again to the idea of an intruder, even when confronted with facts that weakened that theory. Still, suspicion alone is not enough. Investigators needed motive. They began digging into the couple's life, carefully, methodically. On the surface, it appeared normal. They had children, a home, a routine centered around farming and family. Friends described the victim as kind, hardworking, dependable, someone with no known enemies. But when police expanded their scope beyond the surface, cracks began to show. Rumors surfaced, quiet at first, then persistent, about an inappropriate relationship between the wife and a younger man who worked in farming circles nearby. Messages, conversations, time spent together that others had noticed but dismissed as harmless. When confronted, the wife denied any affair. She described the relationship as friendly, almost maternal. She expressed outrage that such a suggestion was even being made. The younger man was brought in next. He admitted that messages had been exchanged, mostly on social media. He acknowledged a level of closeness, but insisted there was nothing physical, nothing romantic, and certainly nothing criminal. At this stage, investigators were stuck. They had suspicion, but no hard proof, no weapon, no eyewitnesses, no confession, no forensic evidence tying anyone in the house directly to pulling the trigger. Time passed. Months turned into a year, then two. The case went cold, not because investigators stopped caring, but because they had reached the limits of the evidence available at the time. The community grew restless. Fear settled in. People asked how a murder of this magnitude could go unsolved in a place where everyone knew everyone. Behind the scenes, detectives continued to review the file. One detail kept resurfacing: the phones. At the time of the initial investigation, technology limited what could be recovered from encrypted messaging apps. Certain data, especially deleted messages, was considered inaccessible. Investigators knew conversations had likely taken place, but they could not prove what had been said. That limitation would eventually change everything. Years later, advancements in digital forensic tools allowed experts to breach deeper layers of data, firewalls that had once been impenetrable. Old devices were re-examined, deleted content was reconstructed, and when those messages resurfaced, they rewrote the entire case. What investigators uncovered was no longer rumor or speculation. It was explicit, direct, chilling. Conversations revealed not just an affair, but discussions about killing the victim. Messages exchanged in the early morning hours of the murder aligned with the exact window of time when the shots were fired. There were references to evidence, to shell casings, to ensuring the job was done. This was not coincidence. This was coordination. With that discovery, the narrative collapsed. The intruder theory died instantly. What had once seemed like a tragic mystery was now exposed as something far darker, a calculated betrayal carried out by people the victim trusted most. And after nearly 3 years of silence, investigators were finally ready to act. When detectives finally made their move, it did not come with spectacle. There were no flashing lights, no public announcements, just a quiet certainty that the case which had haunted the town for years was no longer a mystery. It was a matter of proof. The digital evidence changed everything. Messages recovered from mobile devices revealed a relationship that went far beyond rumor. What had been publicly dismissed as harmless conversation was, in reality, intimate, secretive, and emotionally charged. The exchanges showed frustration, resentment, and a growing fixation on a future without the victim. But the most disturbing messages were not about love, they were about murder. Investigators found conversations discussing methods, timing, and the aftermath. There were references to gun casings, to making sure nothing could be traced back, to silence. Messages sent in the early hours of the morning aligned precisely with the estimated time of death. This was no longer circumstantial. It was direct evidence of intent. Arrest warrants were issued. The first arrest stunned the community. Many people had believed, even until the very end, that the victim's wife could not possibly be capable of such an act. She was known as outgoing, involved, a parent who volunteered, a business owner who greeted clients daily. To them, she was familiar, and familiarity often disguises truth. When confronted with the charges, she appeared calm, almost detached. There were no dramatic protests, no breakdowns. She was formally charged with first-degree murder. Shortly afterward, the second arrest followed. The younger man, once dismissed as a rumor, was taken into custody as a co-conspirator. When faced with the recovered messages, his resistance collapsed quickly. He admitted involvement, acknowledging that he and the victim's wife had planned the killing together. The motive, investigators concluded, was a convergence of desire and resentment. The victim represented stability, routine, a life anchored in responsibility. The relationship between the two accused thrived on fantasy, private conversations, emotional validation, escape. What began as secrecy evolved into entitlement, and entitlement hardened into something far more dangerous. Money also entered the picture. Investigators discovered a substantial life insurance policy naming the wife as the beneficiary. While collecting insurance is not a crime, the timing and context were impossible to ignore. Combined with the messages, it formed a chilling financial incentive layered on top of emotional betrayal. As the case moved to court, prosecutors laid out their narrative carefully. They did not portray the crime as a moment of passion. They presented it as a sequence of deliberate choices, each one leading closer to an irreversible act. They emphasized that even if the fatal shots were fired by one person, responsibility extended to both. Planning is participation. The defense attempted to shift blame. One accused the other of manipulation. The other claimed emotional vulnerability and denial of intent. But digital records do not respond to emotion. They speak in timestamps, words, and patterns. And the words were devastating. Witnesses testified about arguments that had once been dismissed as exaggerations, statements that had sounded like dark humor, about wishing someone were dead, about shooting someone in the face, now returned with horrifying relevance. Neighbors who once described a normal, happy household now struggled to reconcile that memory with the evidence presented. When the jury deliberated, it did not take long. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Soon after, the second accused chose not to face a jury. He pleaded guilty, accepting the same sentence. There would be no future appeals, no reduced time, no second chance. For the family left behind, the verdict did not bring peace, but it ended the waiting. It confirmed what they had feared and suspected for years. The man they loved had not been killed by a stranger. He had been betrayed by those closest to him. The town, too, was changed. Trust was fractured. Familiar faces carried new shadows. The idea that something so calculated could grow quietly inside an ordinary home forced people to question assumptions they had never thought to challenge. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a crime of secrecy. And secrecy, when left unchecked, had proven deadly. The courtroom was silent when the trial entered its final phase. By then, the case was no longer about uncovering the truth. That work had already been done. What remained was something heavier: consequence. Prosecutors focused on one central idea. This was not a crime born in a single night. It was the end result of months of secrecy, emotional manipulation, and deliberate choices. The digital evidence was laid out step by step, allowing the jury to follow the evolution of the relationship from private conversations to explicit coordination. Messages once thought deleted were now read aloud. Each timestamp anchored the narrative in reality. Late-night exchanges, escalating resentment, discussions that crossed a line no argument or affair ever should. The defense attempted to humanize the accused. They spoke of stress, dissatisfaction, emotional vulnerability. They argued that fantasy had been mistaken for intent, that words typed in private did not necessarily translate into real-world action, but the prosecution countered with precision. Words alone were not the issue, actions were. The evidence showed preparation, awareness, cleanup, silence, and above all, cooperation. The jury was reminded that intent does not always require pulling the trigger. In the eyes of the law, planning, encouragement, and concealment are acts of participation. Responsibility is shared when a crime is designed together. As testimony continued, witnesses described the victim not as a symbol, but as a person, a man who worked long hours, who planned his life around his children, who believed he was building something lasting for his family, for his future. Those testimonies were difficult to hear. Friends spoke of his generosity, his reliability, his habit of showing up when others needed help. There was no bitterness in their words, only disbelief that someone so steady could be erased so suddenly. Then came the victim impact statements. Family members took the stand, one by one, describing what the murder had taken from them. Not just a brother, a son, a father, but a sense of safety they could never recover. Children who struggled to sleep, who feared the dark, who could not understand why the people meant to protect them were gone in different ways. The courtroom listened as lives were measured not in years, but in absences. The judge made it clear that sympathy could not override accountability. The sentence for first-degree murder was mandatory. There would be no discretion, no parole, no reduction, life in prison. The words landed heavily. For the accused, the sentence marked the end of freedom. For the children, it marked the beginning of a life shaped by loss, of a father taken by violence, and a mother taken by consequence. Soon after, the second trial was rendered unnecessary. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the outcome already witnessed, the co-conspirator pleaded guilty. The sentence mirrored the first. 2 lives, bound together by secrecy and betrayal, now bound permanently by incarceration. Outside the courtroom, the town struggled to move forward. This was not the kind of crime that fades quietly. It had unfolded slowly, publicly, and painfully. People questioned their assumptions about marriage, about appearances, about how well anyone truly knows what happens behind closed doors. Conversations shifted, parents spoke more openly with their children, couples reassessed communication, community leaders emphasized accountability, not just trust. The idea that this could never happen here had been shattered. For investigators, the case became a reminder of patience and persistence. Had technology not advanced, the truth might have remained buried indefinitely. Justice in this case did not arrive quickly, but it arrived decisively. And yet, no outcome could be called a victory. A man was dead. Children were orphaned in every meaningful sense. An entire community carried the weight of a betrayal that felt personal. The story forced a harsh realization into the open. Violence does not always erupt. Sometimes it grows quietly, fed by secrecy, entitlement, and the belief that consequences can be avoided. In the end, those beliefs proved fatally wrong. What remained was not just a closed case, but a cautionary legacy, one that would linger long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded. When the courtroom doors finally closed, the case was legally over, but nothing about its impact truly ended. In the days that followed sentencing, life in the town slowly returned to routine on the surface. Crops still needed tending, businesses reopened, children went back to school. From the outside, it looked as though normalcy had returned. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had changed. This case did not fit the way people understood crime. It did not involve strangers, gangs, or desperation born of poverty. It came from familiarity, from trust, from a home where children slept peacefully upstairs while a plan unfolded below. That reality unsettled people more than the crime itself, because it meant safety could no longer be defined by location or reputation. It meant that danger did not always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it hid behind smiles, routines, and the comfort of knowing someone. For the victim's family, closure was a complicated word. The verdict confirmed the truth, but it did not restore what had been taken. Birthdays would come and go without a father present. Milestones would be reached with an absence that could never be filled. The children would grow up knowing their story was different, not because of fate, but because of deliberate choices made by adults they once trusted. In many ways, they were sentenced too, not by a judge, but by circumstances they had no control over. The community struggled with its own form of grief. People replayed interactions in their minds, conversations, moments that once seemed insignificant. They questioned whether warning signs had been missed, whether rumors should have been taken seriously sooner, whether silence had allowed something dangerous to grow unchecked. That self-examination was uncomfortable, but necessary. Because this case exposed a truth many prefer to avoid. Secrecy thrives in environments where, when people are afraid to ask hard questions or dismiss concerns as gossip, accountability weakens, and where accountability weakens, harm finds room to grow. Investigators later acknowledged that without advancements in technology, the case might never have been solved. Digital evidence, once thought permanently erased, became the foundation of justice. Messages written in confidence, assumed to vanish, ultimately became the loudest witnesses in the courtroom. There was a bitter irony in that. What was hidden most carefully became what destroyed the illusion entirely. The legal system did what it was designed to do. It weighed evidence, applied the law, and delivered a sentence proportionate to the crime. But justice, in the emotional sense, remained elusive. No sentence could undo the betrayal. No verdict could restore trust. No explanation could make sense of a decision that erased so many lives at once. The case became a cautionary tale far beyond the town itself. It was discussed in law enforcement circles, legal classrooms, and true crime communities, not because of its shock value, but because of its familiarity. This was not a story about monsters. It was a story about people, people who made choices, people who believed they would not be caught, people who underestimated the weight of their actions, and people who paid the highest possible price for someone else's decisions. In the end, the most haunting aspect of this case is not how complex it was, but how ordinary its beginnings were. A marriage under strain, private messages, emotional escape, resentment allowed to fester instead of being confronted. Nothing dramatic at first, until everything was. This is why the story continues to resonate, because it forces an uncomfortable question upon anyone willing to listen. How many tragedies begin quietly, while everyone assumes things are fine? The legacy of this case is not just a closed file or a life sentence. It is a reminder, one written in irreversible loss, that honesty matters, accountability matters, and silence can be dangerous. For the town, for the family, and for those who hear this story, the lesson is the same. Evil does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it grows patiently, hidden in plain sight, and by the time it reveals itself, it is already too late.